Hello, fourth graders. It is time for our social studies lesson. Chapter 6, Lesson 3, Down Go the Tall Trees. Our focus question is did what did Michigan gain and what did Michigan lose from the way it used its trees? Everyone wanted lumber. Timber! Shouts the log cutter. The big tree slowly falls to the ground and hits with a crash. Men scurry around to cut off limbs and saw the trunk into logs. Smell that fresh sawdust. Lumber days were exciting times for Michigan. There were some mighty interesting people working the woods. They had nicknames like Dynamite Jack, Criss Cross Hall, Cedar Root Charlie, and Slabwood Johnson. They were tough and they worked hard. Next subheading, once wasted, now valuable, worth a lot. The first farmers got rid of trees just to plant crops. There were many more trees than they could ever use. Many were cut and burned. The supply of trees was much greater than the demand. At the time, trees were not worth very much. After the Civil War, demand increased. Buildings were destroyed in the fighting. Wood was needed to rebuild. People wanted new homes in fast growing cities like Chicago. Others moved to the western states, and there were not many trees there. Everyone wanted more wood in the 1860s and 1870s. It was a time of rebirth and growth and construction. Earlier, the states of Maine and New York had been the leading lumbering states, meaning they supplied the wood to build homes and businesses. Now their supply of trees was shrinking. And guess what? Michigan had plenty of trees. Let's go to the next page here. Where the best trees are. The best trees for lumber was the white pine. That's an answer to a question that you have. The best trees for lumber were white pines. That also happens to be our Michigan state tree. These pines grew in the Upper Peninsula and in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula. 2/3 of Michigan was covered by straight, majestic pines. Some of them reached over 100 feet towards the sky. The best trees could be about 200 feet tall. They could be 5 to 7 feet across. These giants had been growing for about 300 years or even more. The workers. Large lumber companies bought the land, and with it came the trees. The trees were cut with axes and hand saws. Remember, boys and girls, there wasn't electricity, so they had to do everything by hand. The saws were big, and they needed 2 men to do work for it. The men who did all the cutting and chopping were called lumberjacks, or another name is shanty boys, and that happens to be another question on your exit ticket. They were known as shanty boys because they lived in the shanties or little bunkhouses. All the men lived in the lumber camp. Many of the loggers were immigrants. That's a new vocabulary word for us. Immigrants mean that they moved from Michigan from other countries. We are all immigrants. Many of you have moved here from Yemen, and many of you have moved here from Bangladesh, and others from the Ukraine and Poland, and so on. But these immigrants were from Sweden, and others were born in Finland, Norway, or Canada. Let's go ahead and turn to the next page. Here's the next page. Using nature's gifts. Often a winter job. So fourth graders, they worked year round. Winter, spring, summer, fall. And honestly, at first, the work was done in the winter. It was easier to move those huge, big logs over the ice. The big logs were put on sleds, and the horses or the oxen pulled the sleds. Still, it was too far to pull the logs all the way to the sawmill. Now, a sawmill is the picture here. This is the picture here. And this is what a sawmill looked like in the 1880s. We see the huge spinning saw blade. Again, this was not run on electricity, so it might have been run on water, hydroelectric power, or possibly steam. But this is what the sawmill looked like. And the shanty boys often use rivers to carry the logs. What a great idea. Rivers move the logs. Logs float. So rivers were the perfect way to move them to the sawmills. The shanty boys worked all winter. They cut down trees and dragged the logs to the river. The logs were stacked up along the bank. The stack grew each day until spring. After the ice melted, the rivers were high with water, and then the rivers flowed their fastest. Excuse me. All at once, the logs were pushed into the river. Away they went. Lumbermen went along with them. Some men called themselves river hogs. Another new vocabulary, and probably another answer to a question on your exit ticket. These river hogs were men that balanced on the logs as they floated along. They wore boots with sharp spikes to help them stay on the logs. What did these men with these strange names do? The river hogs kept the logs from piling up into a log jam. If a log jam started, meaning all the logs wanted to get in and down the river and they were jammed, kind of like a car jam or a traffic jam, if the log jam started, the whole river would fill up with logs for miles and miles and miles, and nothing moved. The river hogs would help unclog that jam. Lumber camps grew up along the rivers. Makes sense, doesn't it, fourth graders? The camps grew up along those rivers because that's where the lumberjacks or shanty boys lived. Now, the Saginaw River Valley was the first main lumbering region. Logging continued there until the early 1900s. Once there were 112 sawmills between Saginaw and Bay City. Next page. The other major lumber area was along the Muskegon River. As years passed, logging moved further north into the Upper Peninsula. Many towns started in the northern part of Michigan during the lumber years. The towns began as people moved north to cut the trees. Here is a list of some of the Michigan lumber towns. We have Alpena, Baraga, Bay City, Sheboygan, Escanaba, Manistee, Manistique, Menominee, Muskegon, Saginaw, and Traverse City. Some of these cities you could find on a Michigan map. They all still exist. Some of them are in the Upper Peninsula, and some of them are in the lower northern peninsula. So what was life like for a shanty boy? Maybe you wanted a job like this if you were living in that time. The life of a shanty boy. The day began in the cold and dark before the sun was up. Men drove sprinkler sleds or sleighs, which held large tanks of water. What were they doing? Well, they sprayed that water all over the roads, and the water coated the trail and formed a slick layer of ice. The ice on the roads made it easier for the sleds full of logs. Now, we also have to feed all of those shanty boys. So we had the cook and the cook's helpers. They began work early as well. It was a big job to make breakfast. Bread, biscuits, cookies, and pies were put into the oven. Donuts were fried. Pancake batter was mixed and put into the skillet. Gallons of coffee and tea were brewed. All of this cooking was done on a huge wood-burning stove. Again, there wasn't gas stoves. There wasn't electric stoves. Those weren't invented yet. So they had to stoke the fire with the logs and heat it up and heat up that stove so that they could cook. Now, the shanty boys were up and out of their bunks before daylight. They gathered in the cookhouse and ate a huge breakfast. Talking was always forbidden while eating. It was an old logger's custom. So if I have an exit ticket question that said, true or false, did the loggers talk or the shanty boys talk during breakfast? You would have to answer false. They did not talk. They ate and ate and ate. Let's turn the page. The shanty boys or lumberjacks worked hard all day long. Fourth graders, they would not come back to camp until it was dark. So they got up before the sun and they went to sleep right as it was getting dark. They worked 6 days a week and their pay was about $1 a day. Interesting fact. Here we have our first tall tale about Paul Bunyan. Now, a tall tale, remember, is something that is told over and over and over for hundreds and hundreds of years. It gets to be bigger and people add to it, and all of a sudden it sounds too good to be true. During their day off, the shanty boys told legends and stories. One of their favorite stories was about Paul Bunyan. Each time the story was told, something was added to it. Soon the stories were really hard to believe, but that just made them better. They might say, Paul Bunyan was 12 feet, 11 inches tall without his socks. Now that would be if you had your dad and maybe your uncle stand on each other's shoulders. They may not be as tall as Paul Bunyan, so you can tell. Kind of too hard to believe. Did you know that Paul Bunyan had a pet ox called Babe? Babe was huge and she was colored blue. What color? She was blue. Why? Because Paul found Babe frozen in the ice of Lake Superior. Babe had turned blue from the cold. Now, remember on the other page, we talked about how the shanty boys put the logs into the river, and the river hogs rode these logs down the river and made sure that these logs didn't get jammed up. So we have a large sawmill. We see steam coming out here, and we see some ships that are waiting to be loaded with all of this wood. Let's get back to our reading. The trees fall faster. At first, people said Michigan's trees would last forever. But boys and girls, we know that that doesn't happen. When we cut down a tree, it takes years and years and years for that tree to get as big as the one they cut down. As time passed, the loggers discovered new ways to cut down trees faster and faster, and they built better equipment. A wagon maker from Manistee invented big wheels, and these were really big wheels. Logs were chained to the axle in the middle, and now horses or oxen could drag the logs. They could be moved in the summer or the winter, so they didn't get stuck in the mud or stuck in the water. They were huge. Now, someone else thought about using a small railroad with narrow tracks. New saws were made for the sawmills. And the logs, well, they were cut into boards faster than ever. More trees were cut than ever before. How much was cut? Well, how much lumber came from Michigan? This was big, big business. From 1840 to 1900, in those years, about 170 trillion board feet were cut. Wow, that is enough to circle the earth. What does a big number like that mean? That's more than enough wood to build a floor to cover the entire state of Michigan. Rhode Island could be covered with the leftovers. Now, Let's take a look at this picture here. And this is a picture of what the loggers left. They left the tree stumps. Now, these are the white pine tree stumps that were left. But what happened? This used to be gorgeous and green and lush. But now, because nothing is growing and the trees are dead, we have just nothing. These pine tree stumps without trees and plants to hold the topsoil in place, well, guess what? The wind and the rain washed away all that fertile, good, rich soil. The land was no longer very useful for farming. Oh no. We have to change our ways. We have to keep planting trees as we are cutting them down. But don't worry, fourth graders, we learned. It says, oops, they forgot to plant more. Today, we do not see many really tall trees in Michigan. If you look around, you might say, oh, that's a really big tree. I can't hug it. But guess what? The trees way back in the day were twice, 3 times, maybe 4 times as big as the ones that you think are big. The lumberjacks did not think about planting more. They just cut and cut and cut and cut. There was very little conservation. Now, here's another vocabulary word that will be on your exit ticket. Conservation is as we cut things down, we plant things. It says lumbering was done without little thought about the future. They cut all the trees for quick money, and they did not think about saving anything for tomorrow. Not a plant, not a tree, nothing. And here we have what was left behind. It took nature a really long time to grow a state full of trees, and it will take a long time for the giant trees to grow back. We will have to help them grow. What does this mean? Let's take a look at the next page. Our very last page of our chapter. So it says this means everyone should be careful in the woods. We should not cut down young trees. We should not leave campfires burning. That includes backyard fire pits. Fourth graders, please be careful when you go walking in the woods. Pick up your trash. Actually, bring them back and pick up other people's trash. Clean up your parks. Don't set fires. And if you do set a fire to cook food or to have a bonfire to make s'mores or hamburgers or hot dogs, make sure that fire is completely out by using water. Forest fires can kill many of the trees again. And if we remember, we had a mystery science that talked about wildfires. Sometimes wildfires are started by people not being kind and leaving just a little bit of a campfire, little spark, not drenching that campfire with water. Last subheading, the last giants. There are only a few places where the original white pines are still standing. One is called Hartwick Pine State Park near Grayling, Michigan. And if you look at your hand and you look at your tallest finger, maybe at one of your knuckles, that's about where Grayling is. It's in the upper part of the Lower Peninsula. Most people will never see one of these 200-foot giants unless they visit the park. And take it from me, it is amazing. We don't cut down trees for lumber anymore. What we do cut down are trees to make paper. And that's where we grind up the tree into kind of wood chips, and then we grind it up smaller and smaller and smaller, and it makes pulp, and that pulp makes paper. Let's take a look at some of the questions that will be on your exit ticket. Number 1, at one time people burned trees just to get rid of them. What changes caused the trees to become valuable? What happened at the beginning of this chapter? Remember, all of a sudden, the Civil War ended and trees, lumber became valuable. We had to rebuild America. We were suffering from fires and fighting. So that's why they became valuable. Number 2, what kind of tree was used so much during our lumber days, remember, it's right up here. The white pine, right? The white pine is not only our state tree, but it's what was so valuable during the lumber days. Why were rivers so important to early lumbering? Remember, how did they transport them? They didn't have big enough boats. They didn't have cars and trucks. They didn't have the technology that we have today. We had sleds, we had horses, and we had oxen. So if we could float those logs down the river, oh my goodness, they could go miles and miles and miles to the sawmill to be cut into boards. Number 4, who is an immigrant? Remember, an immigrant is a person who comes from a country far away. You are an immigrant if you came from Yemen and you came here to live. I am an immigrant. My family came from Poland to live. We lived in Hamtramck and then we moved into a different city. Number 5, did the trees last long enough for people, as long as people first thought they would? Remember, what did the lumberjacks do? What did those shanty boys do? They cut and cut and cut and made lots and lots of money, but they left the stumps, which eroded the soil, and the farms couldn't farm the soil. They forgot to plant the trees. And that brings us to our last vocabulary word, which is conservation, which is for every tree that we cut, we need to plant another. That's the end of it. Go to your exit ticket and answer your questions. Please do your very, very best. Remember complete sentences with a capital and a period. You can do it. I know you can.